economic thought in the very late empire, the last 10 years or so of the empire's existence. And in doing that, I'm hoping that I can address, or at least put on the table, a much broader question, which may seem somewhat trite as I pose it, but that question is why liberal policies, and by this I mean, of course, classical liberal economic policies, why they are abandoned, why the states or polities abandon classical liberal economic policies. And one response to that, of course, one answer to that, is that these are abandoned in response to changing circumstances, changing economic realities, or other kinds of economic needs that society faces. Another answer to the question is that states or societies abandon classical liberal economic policies in the pursuit of some other goals, some other social or political, in any case, non-economic goals or strategies. And so I wanted us to put that on the table to keep that in mind perhaps, as I tell you this very, to me anyway, very interesting little story for the next few minutes about the late Ottoman Empire. Because as a matter of fact, this question occurs in the economic history of the late Ottoman Empire, admittedly not a huge field of study, but an interesting one nevertheless. Because in the 19th century, Ottoman economic thought and official Ottoman state economic policy was predicated on classical liberalism, on free trade, property rights, on low tariffs, these kinds of things. By the early 20th century, or in the early 20th century, these policies were abandoned. So I'm asking why that was. And that's the things that I want to look at again in my brief remarks this afternoon. In the secondary literature, the way that this question is answered is usually that these classical liberal policies, or the abandonment of these classical liberal policies, was a good thing, actually. It showed a kind of economic maturity on the part of the rulers of the empire, that they got rid of all those woolly-headed ideas about free trade and low taxes and property rights and this kind of thing, and that this was somehow or other almost a natural step in the evolution of the Ottoman state, the abandonment of liberal economic policies in exchange for statist ones. But as you can probably guess by now, I'm going to tell you a little bit of a different story as to why these policies were in fact abandoned by 1914. As I mentioned, in the 19th century, the Ottoman state had pursued a largely liberal economic program, and this continued after 1908. After something that's known in historians as the Young Turk Revolution, and Mustafa alluded to this very briefly, I think. This was a revolution that was spearheaded by a loose-knit coalition of individuals and groups, collectively called by Europeans, not by themselves, by Europeans, called the Young Turks. And the dominant party in this coalition was called the Committee of Union and Progress. And as you might be able to tell by their name, they were motivated primarily by positivism, by Comtean positivism. They just substituted the order and progress, they put union in progress. But their main interest, their main ideological background was positivism. So this meant that they had a very sort of progressive, modernizing sort of agenda for themselves and for the empire. But initially, at least, they were fully committed to modernizing the empire within a liberal, or at least a liberal economic context. And their first Minister of Finance in the new government was named Mentzel. He'd been a member of their inner circle, as it were. He was a longtime member of the committee. And he was himself a strong supporter of liberal economic policies. So that meant that he wanted to strengthen property rights, he wanted to simplify the tax code, and so forth. And he took a number of steps in this direction. He introduced a new simplified method of tax collection, which raised government revenue by 25%. Admittedly, maybe even one cheer for that, at least. He also supervised the passage of a land law in 1911 and a new inheritance law in 1913, both of which simplified and streamlined rules and regulations regarding property rights in land and in movable wealth. He also was a very strong proponent of free trade and an opponent of protectionism. He believed that protectionism would destroy any long-term hopes for the empire's prosperity. In one of his many essays, for example, in one of his many essays, he wrote that protectionism is the greatest enemy of the worker. Behind protective tariffs, he continued, 2 or 3 capitalists, he actually says owners of capital, would become rich, while thousands of our countrymen would be impoverished. So instead of trying to build a state-supported industry behind protectionist barriers, he stressed the importance of agriculture and commerce. In another one of his essays he wrote, perhaps overstating his point, we are today and will be tomorrow an agricultural country. So he believed that the best hopes for the economic development of the empire lay in exploiting the empire's comparative advantage in agriculture. He also argued that such domestic and foreign capital as there was would be best directed, if possible, towards the development of more productive exploitation of the empire's agricultural resources through such things as railways, port improvements, wagon roads, so on and so forth. And he hoped that these policies would increase foreign investment, which he actively and eagerly courted as a way of developing the empire. But in this plan, he ran into a number of difficulties. The liberals, among them, whom I count John Gabb, faced 2 important but related challenges to their ideas. And for the purposes of this paper, I'm calling them socialists and solidarists. The socialists were not very numerous in the empire. They did have some members in the Ottoman parliament. And one of the most outspoken members of the parliament was a deputy from Istanbul named Krikor Zohrab Efendi. And there was a very interesting exchange in the minutes of the Ottoman parliament between Gabb and Zohrab Efendi over the issue of protectionism. And basically, to sort of just give you this in a nutshell, Gabb's argument was that protectionist tariffs would essentially ruin any prospects for the economic development of the empire by shutting out the possibility of foreign capital investment, whereas Zohrab Efendi argued that foreign investment was really just an example of the depredation of European finance capital, that it really would basically enslave the empire. Now, one thing that is a very interesting twist on all of this is that the writings by Ottoman socialists didn't have a tremendously wide circulation and weren't really very popular until, interestingly enough, an import by the name of Alexander Hoppe, who was a Russian socialist, a Marxist-Leninist, moved to the empire in 1912 in a kind of self-imposed exile. And Hoppe, writing under the pen name Harfus Effendi, actually popularized statist economic ideas in the empire. He argued in a classical Marxist-Leninist style that the Ottoman Empire was being reduced to the status of a colony through the investments of European bankers and capitalists, that these predatory capitalists were, for instance, enslaving the empire. And the only way out of this situation, argued Harfus Effendi, was for the state to take a strong role in managing the economy and especially fostering industry through protective tariffs. Now, his goal in all of this was, of course, I guess, dialectical, right? What he wanted to see was the development of an Ottoman bourgeoisie. He was a needed bourgeoisie for the eventual socialist revolution. So he said the only way we're going to get a bourgeois class in the Ottoman Empire is through these, with the help of the state. Now, what's very interesting to me is that Harfus Effendi published these writings, he published these essays, not in the Ottoman socialist press. He published them in a journal called Turkish Home. Now, this magazine, Turkish Home, wasn't filled with decorating tips or recipes, or it wasn't that kind of a Turkish Home magazine. It was actually the magazine published by a group of Turkish nationalists. And this is one of the movements to which Mustafa Bey referred in his remarks this morning. This was one of the intellectual currents circulating during the last few years of the Ottoman Empire. And the Turkish nationalists were interested in Parvus Efendi's ideas, not because they were socialists, but because his ideas fit very well with their own agenda. And their own agenda, of course, was to transform the Ottoman Empire into a Turkish state. In particular, they were interested in the ideological tool with which they were engaged in this effort. Is sometimes translated solidarism. In Turkish, it's tesadücü. And this is very similar. This idea is very similar to some of the ideas that were circulating all over Europe and North America at about the same time. It purported to espouse a kind of third way between capitalism and socialism, one that in the place of the class conflict of socialism, or allegedly in capitalism, it substituted cooperation between classes and a state-directed effort to reorganize society and the economy into corporate bodies. And these ideas are circulating, as I said, all over Western Europe and North America at this same time. By organizing society this way, society could thus be modernized, the economy could be strengthened, and class conflict could be avoided all in one go. Part of this program that drew very heavily on the writings of Friedrich List, the German economist, also argued for support and development of industry by means of high and selective tariffs. Right. So, by 1913 or so, therefore, the liberal and statist economic programs were pretty well staked out on both sides. And the liberals ended up losing. So why is that? Well, I think that the reason that the liberal ideas were finally abandoned because the solidarist ideas, the economic ideas accompanying solidarism, fit very neatly with the development of Turkish nationalist ideas on the part of the members of the Committee of Union and Progress. Not only that, in January 1913, some of the members of the Committee of Union and Progress staged a coup d'etat by which they essentially seized control of the Ottoman government. So by the spring of 1913, many of the members, not all, but many of the members of the Committee of Union and Progress were interested in developing a Turkish nation, in building a Turkish national identity, a Turkish nation that would dominate the empire, and they seized upon the ideas of solidarism as an ideological tool to put that program into effect. So all they needed then was the opportunity to do so, which happened along in the summer of 1914. And some historians argue that one of the reasons that the Ottoman state became involved in World War I in 1914 was precisely to provide a national crisis situation in the empire, during which they could implement some of their anti-liberal program. And indeed, they got right to work. As soon as they joined the war, they passed a law for encouragement of industry, which set up state control, state direction over industrial development. They established something called the Society of Guilds, which sought to reorganize all economic activity in the empire according to state-directed corporations, and something called the Committee of National Defense that again sought to bring all economic activity under the control of the state. These different committees and corporations, of course, were all staffed with CUP cadres, with people who were loyal to the CUP. And the CUP's plan was to use these cadres then as the nucleus of the Turkish national bourgeoisie that would then in turn dominate the state. Well, as a matter of fact, they actually did have some success during the war in both cases. There was some industrialization, and some of these cadres of these different CUP-sponsored organizations did become very wealthy. They became known as the rich of 1916 for all of the money they made dominating these different state-sponsored organizations. But the real price, of course, for all of this was paid by people who were not connected to the CUP networks. And largely, these were the small farmers and sharecroppers of Anatolia and the workers in the urban centers of the empire. During the war, the rural economy was largely wrecked, and prices in the cities during the course of the war rose by 400%. So to wrap this story up then, the CP's solidarist statist policies led the empire to war and ruined the economy. And as Mehmet Javits had predicted, these kinds of policies indeed enriched a few people, in this case the CP's agents, while it impoverished an entire empire. Thanks very much.